tonight's conversation is basically going to be, what's the problem and why is it so hard, or why does it seem to be so difficult for quote-unquote gay men to get into a relationship, get past the 6-month mark, get past the 3-year mark, and hang out for a while. I'm going to talk a little bit about this because I have some caveats on it. The first thing I want to share with you is a little bit about me. Not in that sort of narcissistic sense, but a way of sort of orienting you and orienting myself in the work that I do. This is an important area for research for me because it affects me personally and it affects all the clients that I work with. So who am I? In the words of Sophia Petrillo, picture it, but we'll go back to that in a minute. I stand before you, a gay, single, 50-year-old man, born, bred, and reared in New York City. I'm currently living in New York City. Now what that means is it's a preamble to an apology. Being from New York, I have a tendency to offend on sight, so I just want to apologize in advance in case I do that. Okay, are you from New York? Okay, cool. See? And so I just want to apologize up front about that. The other thing is that as a gay, the single part, I want to render the single part for a moment because this is actually a new phenomenon for me over the last 9 months. So that's been a very challenging thing to have this intersection between my academic work, my professional work, and my personal life all come together at the very same place. The fact that I'm going for another PhD is just a way of saying I'm a masochist. But I say this is an important thing because one of the things that I noticed is a friend of mine posted on Facebook, I was not chosen as one of the 100 eligible bachelors in Out magazine. I'm sure that was just an oversight. But my interest in this particular area of romantic relationship formation and maintenance didn't start recently. It started when I first came out. And I came out in New York City at the height of the AIDS crisis. It was a very scary time, and two things were happening to me simultaneously. One was this really big urge I had in my heart to actually do something about all the people, help in some way. The other was that I was coming out. So I went to work at the Manhattan Center for Living in New York City under the direction of Marianne Williamson. And basically, I started volunteering and wound up the assistant clinical director. I had no education at the time. That's a whole other story. The education happened after the fact. But I also was coming out. And what was available to me way back then were bars. And I thought that coming out was going to be tough talking to my parents. Turns out what was really tough was finding my identity and membership within the gay community at that time. There was no welcome wagon for someone of my type. At least I didn't know about it. So what happened was I went to bars and I would speak to the bartender, the captive audience that was available, and I'd build these relationships with them that were very nice and warm, and they were very accommodating and welcoming. But the whole relationship thing, the whole dating thing really escaped me. Very often it's related to the truncation of early adolescence. We don't date necessarily, at least in my generation, during the high school years or the junior high school years. That explanation doesn't hold water anymore. But two miracles happened. The first miracle was the protease inhibitors. That changed the landscape of HIV and AIDS infection. And it was a very big deal because when I was working, people were coming in very, very sick and they were dying very, very fast. And that changed all that. But there was another miracle. It was the miracle of AOL. All of a sudden I had a venue that I could talk. You all remember AOL? And the sounds of AOL? Okay. And that it took 20 minutes to download a picture. And in that 20 minutes, I could actually talk to people and chat with people and express myself and use my ideas instead of just how I looked. And this was very formidable because that's where I met my partner. And we spent 15 years together. And this became more and more significant to me because the bottom line of this problem comes to something that a friend of mine told me at dinner not just a few weeks ago. He said, "Oh, you mean BBD?" And I went, "What? BBD?" And he said, "Yeah, BBD, the bigger, better deal. In my day, it was called the grass is greener, but in the current vernacular, it's around this notion of BBD, bigger, better deal. This notion that what we have in front of us is never enough. And so what I want to talk to you about today, with a couple of caveats, is that this is not about single bashing. A researcher named Apollo did a lot of work on how single people are often marginalized and pathologized for being single. There are many, many people who are totally satisfied with their single existence. This is not about monogamy. The research indicates that monogamy is not necessary for relationship satisfaction at all. At all. The survey that I ran last year indicated that about 89% of gay men wish that they were in a relationship. An intimate relationship. And I won't go into definitions of intimate relationships because we would be here for the next 3 days. According to the research of Gary Dossett, in Australia, most gay men value what you can have in an intimate relationship. They feel it's important. So those are my caveats. Now, this whole process was like opening Pandora's box for me. It was absolutely a very shocking, very depressing experience, which has a happy ending. And I tell you about the happy ending because we're at the Jake Talks, and this is about empowerment. And I believe that information informs uncertainty and that knowledge is actually power. So, from a psychological standpoint, all the way through a New Age spiritual standpoint, difficulties in romantic relationship formation or any interpersonal relationship has a cause, and the cause is always within the individual. So we start out with some kind of developmental deficit. That's your problem. And then we move to something called, a little later on, like this, imagine this timeline. And a little later on, we find out this thing called attachment theory, started by this guy, Bowlby. And attachment theory has to do with this notion that through your primary caretaking relationship, you develop something called secure attachment, or anxious attachment, or avoidant attachment styles. And that these are actually traits, not changeable states. I totally disagree with that model, and I'll tell you why. Then we move up a little bit and we get into, well, it's all about internalized homophobia and self-esteem issues. And if we go a little further, it's because your vision board just isn't quite up to par. Okay? What I want to do, how many of you are familiar with this painting? We look at the individual, but often through the psychological lens, we look at the individual in the absence of culture and sociology. So what I want to do is talk about the socio-cultural phenomena that has to do with the creation of the individual and the creation simultaneously of the culture that we live in. They reinforce one another. They create each other. They are part and parcel of one another. You cannot take the fish out of the fish tank without it dying. This is the milieu that we are all in. This becomes less of a gay issue and more of a cultural issue. So one of those forces is neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a very powerful force. We have a sense of what it is politically, but individually, it embodies certain kinds of values. And those values are really important. Those values are things like the individual is the most important. My choice is the most important. Freedom is the most important. And when you start listening to the values, after a while you start to notice, wait, there's no we in there. There's no us in there. There's no construction of what we're going to engage in. There's just you and me, and we'll see what happens. So, George Carlin said, it's called the American dream because you have to be asleep in order to believe it. Brilliant remark. And underneath I wrote something called Have It All. When you get home, I want you to Google Have It All. Have It All was a fake drug that was created because in America, it's all about having it all. So you never have to make a choice, right? Those of you who have made choices tonight to come here, you made other choices not to go someplace else. But for some reason, we don't think that way because the culture keeps reinforcing this kind of thinking. When we look at the larger picture, we see that it's not really about gay men. We have corporations that are actually very greedy, right? And I'm going to get into how this impacts the individual in a few moments. And then we have something called choice overload. Anyone ever hear of this expression, choice overload? So consumer research is really interesting, and I'll tell you why I use consumer research, because we kind of shop for our relationships in the same way. So consumer research. Consumer research says that if I have 3,000 olive oils and you are walking down the aisle, when you stop off to pick an olive oil, you will be so overwhelmed by the choice that you simply won't pick any. If you do, later on, those people that were interviewed question their choice. I think it's called buyer's remorse. Okay? Now, as a New Yorker, when you go shopping for an apartment, not even to buy but to rent, you give your realtor the list, and they chuckle under their breath because the prices are absolutely insane, and you're never going to get all of what you want. But somehow with an apartment, we make a commitment at least for a little while. If we buy a house, we make a commitment for at least a little while. But when it comes to people, we start to do different things. So the other factor culturally is hegemonic masculinity. I don't know if, is anyone old enough besides me to know this ad? Okay. So hegemonic masculinity has everything to do with this sort of idealized version of masculinity. Now in New York, right, because I'm focusing on urban settings, in New York, content analysis reveals very often, in terms of app use, the terms straight acting, masculine, and jock. I think the correlation out here is lumber sexual. Is that right? Okay. So you all have one too. Okay. So these are the neoliberalism, the hegemonic masculinity, the values of these things are the milieu in which we're operating in. Now then we have objectification. Now this used to be just for women. Only men objectified women. But we see that we also engage in this objectification. Parts as parts, right? We don't see whole people, we see parts. And then there's an intersectionality of these parts, which is really interesting. I'll get this right by the end of it. But okay, how does it affect the individual? This milieu that we're all swimming around in. On the individual level, there's something called the dark triad. This really needs ominous music. Every time I say it, I think, oh, the dark triad. But okay, the dark triad is actually something that appeared recently in a Facebook study. It's an old concept in psychology. Facebook did a study of men 18 to 40 who posted selfies. Did y'all read about this? This is fascinating. I'm a researcher, so of course it's fascinating to me. It may not be fascinating to you. And when I'm tired, I lapse into a Jackie Mason, so just warn me, okay? They found that the more selfies a male posted, the higher they were on this thing called the dark triad. Now let me tell you what the dark triad is. The dark triad is fascinating. It's composed of three components. The first is Machiavellianism. Now, I don't know, I read a long time ago The Prince, and the essential message of Machiavellianism was the ends justify the means. The second component is narcissism. Of course, I am the whole world. Right? I had a client who once said, and we often think that this is just about grandiosity, but I had a client who once said, I don't think much of myself, but I'm all I ever think about. So, it's 20 years ago, it still makes me laugh. And the third element is psychopathy, or the inability to empathize, or to have empathy. Okay? So very often these traits are correlated with the way gay men behave. Recently, there was an article in the Huffington Post. It's funny how all this stuff always comes together whenever I'm going to give a talk. But there was an article in the Huffington Post about why I don't want to be gay anymore. Anyone see this? It's on Facebook. Okay, you saw it? It was like, I don't want to be gay anymore because gay men are nothing but lecherous, opportunists, blah, 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 blah. And then I thought about our culture. It's not just gay men. Our whole culture has elements of this in it. So it's kind of unavoidable. Now, remember I talked a little bit about the masculinity, the hegemonic masculinity. This has an impact on men specifically in a term called alexithymia. Now, later I'm going to talk about some of the recipes that we have for maintaining relationships, and this is actually going to be very important. But alexithymia was a term created by Peter Stefanos, who is a psychiatrist, and maybe he is, I'm sorry. I apologize in advance. Alexithymia is the inability to label and express emotion. And masculinity is antithetical to that. Remember I said, hegemonic masculinity is about being tough, it's about being strong, it's not about being emotional, it's not about expressing your emotions, and this is problematic. So these two things are very problematic when it comes to creating connection and intimacy with another. So, the urban setting. What do we have in the urban setting? The urban setting provides us with a tremendous population density, and so there's always competition. Social exchange theory says, I will invest in you as long as everything is working with you. But if it's not working with you, there's someone else just over your shoulder that may be the person I'm looking for. The other is self-help and psychotherapeutic culture. Right? Self-help culture focuses on the individual. It continues to have the focus be on the individual. And it was very interesting as I was listening tonight, I heard people talk about creating community. Why is creating community so important? So that an individual has a different experience of themselves. My sense of myself is reflected through your eyes, how you look at me. And this is going to become very important when I give you the how-tos. Am I caught on something? Yes, I am. And then, of course, technology and media. Michael was very good enough to talk about the apps. The apps are incredibly, 70% to 80% of all relationships are formed online now. We don't have those small little things, especially gay men, where it used to be you'd meet your partner in college or you'd meet your partner at work. Those kinds of contexts were not as available as they are for us today. So that's where the intersection of the individual meets the socio-cultural. Now we have to think about something. How many of you, well, I want to talk about, I'll come back to that, I'm sorry. I told you I'm tired. Intimacy is an interpersonal process. Reese and Hazen did research that indicated the sense of closeness, the sense of connection had everything to do with me sharing with you, you receiving what I share, and seeing me and seeing you in that sharing process. That's what they call intimacy. The other that's been mentioned often here is vulnerability, but that's not enough. Brené Brown's research is all about vulnerability and shame, and working through that shame so that you can be vulnerable, to be strong in one's vulnerability. But what is ultimately very important, why alexithymia is a problem for us as men, not so much as gay men, but for men in general, and women will often, in straight relationships, will often attest to this, is that how the vulnerability is received becomes just as important. One must allow that vulnerability that someone is sharing with us to actually hit us and touch us. So, the recipe. Over the last 25 years, there has been so much research done that we actually know how to start, how to have, how to maintain, and even have that relationship or relationships be erotically satisfying. So we begin with Helen Fisher, cultural anthropologist at Rutgers University, who wrote the book Why We Love, that talked all about the neurotransmitters of love. Then we have something that came out that's now an app. Anyone here of the 36 questions? I see some head nods. I can barely see. I see some head nods. The 36 questions, which is now an app. Arthur Aarons, 20 some odd years ago, did some research on interpersonal process, and he came up with the 36 questions. We know how to start a relationship. John Gottman, where is he from, folks? Yeah. You better believe it, right here, the Love Labs in Seattle. John Gottman found out what actually worked in couples. Sue Johnson, up in Canada, talked about attachment issues and how to have stronger attachment with our partners. Then we move up a little bit to the eroticism part. David Snarch and Esther Perel. Esther Perel wrote the book Mating in Captivity, How to Keep Eroticism Alive in Long-Term Intimate Relationships. So we have this recipe. Question is, why don't we actually do anything with it? So, I told you I opened up a Pandora's box. And I was looking for hope. And I was feeling quite hopeless and very depressed. And then I realized I have always put my faith in people. I have always believed that people with information, with an open heart, with a willing mind, and the willingness to participate could make a difference. So my hope is actually in you. And I want to leave you with a RuPaul line, building on the RuPaul line that was left earlier. When it comes to relationships, you better work. And one of the biggest challenges in relationships, as one of the speakers was talking about, is the willingness to commit, and that's a cognitive choice. So when you find, stop looking, right? My dissertation, one of my advisors once said, the way you finish your dissertation is to stop reading. You stop reading, you start writing. Right? So I want to offer you the same. Stop shopping. Start committing. Start investing. There is always going to be, especially in fantasy, someone better around the corner. So I put my hope and my faith in you, and I'm really glad to be here, and I thank you for your attention and your time. And thank you all for allowing me to be up on this stage and coming to Seattle, and hopefully I will head home tomorrow in the snowstorm and arrive there safely. Thank you very much.